All right, let's kick off this deep dive. And we're going to take a closer look at Esri's demographic data. And you've sent over a bunch of different sources like fact sheets, methodology statements, and even some info about their data browser. So we've got a lot to unpack here. Believe it or not, Esri has demographic data for over 170 countries. And we're not just talking simple population counts.
Oh, it's way more than that. They go deep. I mean, they have everything from like income and education to even psychographics and retail demand. And they even have things like crime rates and consumer spending habits. It's really quite impressive.
I know, it's really mind-boggling. And I have to say, I was particularly fascinated by the way they categorize businesses. It made me wonder how they would classify the businesses in my own neighborhood.
Interesting. Well, maybe we should start with the basics. Then Esri actually has two tiers of data. They have standard demographics, which is pretty consistent no matter the country. And then they have advanced demographics, which has a lot more detail, but it's only available for certain places.
So basically, you can pick the level of detail that you need. It's almost like choosing between, a basic roadmap or like a super detailed topographical map, right? But whether you go basic or advanced, we're talking about data that can be used for tons of different stuff, from market research to public policy analysis.
Exactly. The applications are incredibly diverse. And Esri makes the data accessible in several ways. You can download the raw data files, get reports, use their ArcGIS services, or even explore ready-made maps. It's pretty versatile.
Okay, so let's dive into some of the specifics. The fact sheets on their global coverage really caught my attention. Did you notice how the data vintages are kind of all over the place?
Yeah, it is a bit strange. Australia's data is from 2021. Some European countries have data from 2023, and the US already has 2024 data. It's a wild mix.
It's like time travel in the world of demographics, But hey, speaking of updates, there's a note in here for anyone interested in the Netherlands. Apparently, they're switching up their data source in October 2024.
Right, I saw that the current data source Orange is going to be phased out. So anyone doing work related to the Netherlands should definitely keep an eye out for those updates.
Good point. Now let's shift gears to the demographic data categories document. This thing is like a giant catalog of all the different types of info Esri collects. It's super interesting.
There's definitely a lot to cover. We've got the usual suspects like population and income, but then there's some categories that are a bit more unexpected, like psychographics or retail demand.
You know what I mean? Imagine having data about people's values, attitudes, lifestyles. That's pretty powerful stuff. And they even have a behaviors category.
Oh, yeah. The behaviors category includes data on things like social media, use online shopping habits, and even charitable giving. It's like getting a glimpse into how people actually act, not just who they are on paper.
It's wild. And speaking of getting granular with the data Esri tapestry, have you heard of this? They classify U.S. neighborhoods into 67 different segments.
Oh, yeah. Tapestry. Each segment is like a unique cluster of people based on things like socioeconomic factors, lifestyle choices, and even their consumer preferences. It's kind of like a detailed mosaic of the American population.
Makes you wonder which segment you fall into, right? Okay. Let's switch gears again and talk about something that really caught my eye, Esri's business data. The methodology statement shows that they actually get their data from a company called DataAxle.
And their database is huge. Over 14 million businesses in the US alone, and over 1 million in Canada. It's a lot to work with.
I know. And DataAxle uses a bunch of different ways to gather all that data. They don't just use business directories. They monitor websites, track news alerts, and even do phone verification to make sure everything's accurate.
Like a detective agency for the business world, piecing together all the details about each company.
And get this, they also give each business a NAICS and SIC code, which are those standard industry classification systems, but they go even further.
They add their own 2 digits to those codes so they can get even more specific about the type of business. It's pretty smart.
So they're not just saying, hey, this is a restaurant. They're saying, this is a fancy Italian restaurant that also does catering. You know what I mean?
Exactly. That level of detail is super valuable for anyone trying to get a handle on the business landscape.
Oh, and there's one important thing to keep in mind about the sales volume figures in the data. Those numbers are actually based on employee counts and industry multipliers. They're not necessarily the real reported sales.
Oh, right. So it's more of an educated guess rather than a company's actual financial records. Something to keep in mind.
Definitely. Now, here's another interesting tidbit. DataAxle specifically doesn't count kiosk locations in their business summary calculations.
Kiosk locations, what are those?
You know, like those little spots with ATMs, vending machines, charging stations, things like that. They don't get included in the overall business counts.
Huh, that's interesting. It makes you wonder what other types of businesses might get left out and how that could affect things.
Exactly. Even the most comprehensive data sets have their limits, right?
True. It all comes back to understanding how the data was collected and knowing about any potential biases or gaps. It's not just about the numbers themselves. It's about understanding the context.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit here. Different types of Esri data, global coverage data vintages, and even a bit about their business data. But before we move on,
Yeah.
what stood out to you so far? What's caught your attention?
I have to say, those 67 tapestry segments really stand out.
Yeah.
The way they break down American society is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's wild. I'm still trying to understand how they come up with those categories. It can't just be about age and income, right?
No, it goes way beyond that. They look at lifestyles, consumer preferences, even what kind of media people use. It's like they're creating a profile of people's values and dreams.
And to think you and your neighbors could be grouped together based on all these things, even if you don't know it. It's crazy. And those names, they use Bohemian Mix, Emerald City. It's like they're trying to capture the vibe of each group with a catchy phrase.
Exactly. They're making these complex segments easier to understand and remember. It's a lot easier to remember soccer moms than segment 42.
Yeah, right.
But beyond the names, this data is really useful for anyone trying to figure out consumer behavior.
So for example, a business owner could use tapestry data to see where their ideal customers are likely to live, work, and shop.
Yeah, exactly. Or city planners could use it to figure out what different neighborhoods need. Or political campaigns could use it to target their messages better. There's so many different ways to use it.
It really shows how much data is out there and how it can help us understand the world around us. But let's take a step back for a second and talk about how we get from raw data to actual insights. What are some of the tools and techniques that Esri offers?
Well, they have a lot of options depending on your skill level and the questions you're asking. For example, they have those ready-made maps we talked about earlier. Those are a quick and easy way to see key demographic trends.
Right, like a map that shows population density or areas with a lot of senior citizens. It's a great way to get a visual overview of the data. But what if you want to dig deeper and ask more specific questions?
Then you can use tools like the ArcGIS Geo-Enrichment Service. It lets you pull in specific variables and analyze them against your own data or areas you're interested in.
So if I'm a store owner looking to open a new location, I could use geo-enrichment to see which neighborhoods have the most people who fit my target market.
Exactly. Or a real estate developer could use it to find areas with the best potential for growth and investment.
It sounds pretty powerful, but also kind of complex. Do you need to be a data scientist to use these tools?
Not really. Esri has worked hard to make these tools easy to use even for people who aren't data experts. Their platforms are pretty user-friendly. They have lots of tutorials and support resources too.
That's great to know. Okay, so let's talk about the data itself. How does Esri gather all this information? Do they send people out to knock on doors and do surveys?
Not quite. They use a mix of government censuses, surveys from reputable organizations, and commercial data sources that have been checked for accuracy.
So they're basically pulling data from different places, cleaning it up, standardizing it, and then making it available in a way that's easy to use.
That's a good way to put it. And they keep updating their data as new information comes in. Keeping the data current is really important for demographics because things change so quickly.
Absolutely. Now, let's say someone listening is a researcher or student who wants to use this data. What are their options?
Esri has a few ways to access the data depending on what you need and your budget. You can buy data files, directly subscribe to their online platforms, or even access it through partnerships with universities and libraries.
So there's a way to get access no matter who you are or how much money you have.
Yeah. Esri wants to make sure everyone can use this data from individual researchers to big organizations.
That's awesome. Okay, we've talked about the types of data Esri offers, the tools they provide, and even how to access the data. But before we wrap up this part, I think we should talk about some of the challenges or potential problems with using this kind of data. It's not as simple as just putting numbers in a spreadsheet, right?
You're right. Like, any powerful tool, demographic data can be misused or misinterpreted if you're not careful. We need to be aware of the limitations and biases.
So what are some things we should watch out for?
Well, first of all, we have to remember that demographic data is just a snapshot in time. It shows us the population at a specific moment, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what will happen in the future.
So just because a neighborhood has lots of young families today, doesn't mean it'll still be like that in 5 years.
Exactly. Populations are always moving and changing. We need to remember that demographics are dynamic and not make assumptions based on a single point in time.
What else should we keep in mind?
Data privacy is another big thing. Even though Esri takes steps to protect people's privacy by grouping data together and removing personal information, it's still important to think about the ethical side of using this kind of data.
We need to make sure we're not using it in ways that could hurt or discriminate against people or communities. It's about being responsible and ethical.
Absolutely. And that brings up another potential problem: misinterpreting the data. It's easy to pick and choose data that supports a certain story, but we need to look at all of it objectively.
So we need to be critical thinkers when working with demographic data. Ask the right questions, be skeptical, and challenge our own assumptions.
Exactly. It's about being smart about the information we consume and not believing everything we see. We need to dig deeper, understand the context, and look at things from different angles.
And I imagine the source of the data is important too. Different organizations might have different methods or biases that could skew the results.
Definitely. It's always good to know where the data came from and whether there might be any bias, whether it's from a government agency, a company, or a nonprofit. We need to be careful about what we accept as truth.
All right, I think this is a good place to pause for a second. We've covered a lot, from the basics of Esri's demographic data to the potential pitfalls of using it. But before we continue our deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've talked about all this amazing data that Esri has, from population stats to business details and even those fascinating psychographics. It makes you wonder, what's the next frontier in demographic data? What's coming that could totally change how we see the world?
That's a great question. It really gets at how data itself is changing. One thing that's really evolving quickly is integrating real-time data.
Oh, wow. So we're not just talking about those static snapshots anymore. It's more like a live stream of what's happening.
Exactly. Like, think about social media activity or even location data from people's phones. And then there's sensor data from those smart cities. All those real-time streams give us a chance to understand people's behavior and movements in a whole new way.
It's like, instead of just knowing where people live, we can see where they're going, what they're doing, even who they're talking to.
Exactly. And all that granular real-time data could really shake things up in tons of fields, like urban planning, transportation marketing, even public health.
Imagine predicting traffic jams based on where everyone's phones are, or spotting disease outbreaks before they get out of control.
Right. Those are just a couple examples.
Yeah.
But of course, with more detail comes more responsibility, especially with data privacy and all the ethical stuff. It's a challenge we need to be super careful about.
It seems like the future of demographic data is all about balance. Using these new data streams, but also making sure people's rights and freedoms are safe.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's why these conversations are so important, especially before these technologies get even more powerful. We need some ground rules, some ethical guidelines for how all this sensitive data is collected, used, and shared. It's not just about the technology itself. It's about society as a whole.
That's a really important point. It's not enough to just focus on what the data is. We need to think about how and why it's being used. Data can be really powerful, but it's up to us to use it the right way.
I agree with you there. At the end of the day, it's about using data to help people and communities, not to control or take advantage of them. That's what we should be aiming for.
Absolutely. This has been a fascinating deep dive. We've gone from Esri's basic offerings to what the future might hold, and there's clearly so much more to uncover.
There is.
So to everyone listening, I hope you keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep thinking about the power of data. You never know what you might find.
Yeah, the possibilities are endless.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, but we'll be back soon with another deep dive into something new and exciting. Until then, stay curious.